Okay, there is this concept called environmental justice communities. Basically, these are communities who have a disparate impact on them from environmental degradation like pollution, toxicity, air pollution, water quality issues, and so on. And EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, then sets up processes for solving some of the issues with so-called Superfund sites where grants are issued to solve the particular environmental problem that the community may be facing. This short chapter I'm going to include just for completion's sake, because I'm not an expert on this, protecting environmental justice communities from the detrimental impacts of climate change. So I took several figures to fill in the background, because the text is full of the chapter is full of text and not any figures, so I like figures to explain things. Cumulative carbon dioxide emissions per capita in tons over 1991 to 21 comes from these major countries: Canada and US, many European countries, Russia, and some Australia, and some Central Asian countries here, China, India are of course part of the deal, and some Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, and so on. South Africa is there. BRICS countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are of course part of the story now as well in terms of polluting. Historically, of course, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it's completely dominated by Europe and the US, and maybe Russia in the later part. Nonetheless, since global warming became a well-known issue in the 1990s, now the responsibility is given to all the major polluters. But the impact of climate change on national economy obviously is disproportionately high on the global south and some of the polluting countries like India and China, South Africa, and even Australia is listed here because it's specifically vulnerable to climate change impact. And it continues to have political haggling over what to do about climate change. Okay, of course, what we are worried about in this chapter is not only global disparities in climate change impact on health, but also within country impacts, as we saw during a heat wave within a city like Chicago or Philadelphia. There are different communities that feel the brunt of the heat wave differently based on socioeconomics, the conditions they live in, and the access to public transportation, and so on and so forth. Here is an example of how climate change produces extreme weather, and of course US and Europe are facing extreme weather, so is Russia, but China, India, and this neighborhood with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asian countries, and so on, and some South American countries, Central American countries. These are rankings from 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 50. So the top 10 here include Puerto Rico, Honduras, Myanmar, Haiti, Philippines, Nicaragua, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Dominica, all developing or poor countries. So not good news, considering they are not major emitters either now or historically, right? This is what environmental justice tends to focus on. In the case of specific health outcomes, we are worried about issues like this. This is from the World Economic Forum's report, Pollution Exposure by Population over 2003 to 2015. And this is inequity in a consumption of goods and services adds to racial ethnic disparities in air pollution exposure. So it's a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences in the US, and it's looking at exposed the different ethnic groups exposed to pollution. So in Latin ex-Americans, all countries from Latin America, South Central America, exposed to 63% more pollution than they produce. Black Americans, 56% more pollution than they produce. And in the meantime, non-Hispanic white Americans are exposed to 17% less pollution than they produce in terms of energy consumption, transport, other consumptions of luxury goods, food, and so on and so forth. So it's not just a global issue, it's even within country and even within a state or within a city that these injustices happen. So environmental injustice communities are those communities that are impacted, and here is another example, map of LA. So in the EPA's environmental justice map, red and orange show census block groups in Southern California where close proximity to federal Superfund sites overlap with a high percentage of low-income and minority residents. So Superfund sites, as I said before, are places which have environmental issues that are being solved with these Superfunds, which means often choices of putting wastewater treatment sites, sewage treatment sites, coal-burning power plants, and other polluting industries and so on, obviously are chosen in poorer neighborhoods, and then obviously it's become a serious issue. So now EPA provides a detailed map, neighborhood by neighborhood map of environmental justice communities. Okay, that is obviously a way to making progress towards solving environmental justice issues and adapting to climate change impacts on health to even out disproportionate, disparate impacts on environmental justice communities. Okay. Recommendations from the chapter: community level climate change resiliency plans should be prepared for as many environmental justice communities as possible. Two important issues related to these plans that need to be highlighted here are: community level is not meant to refer to a municipal government. The geographic scope of these plans should coincide with neighborhoods within municipalities and not with the municipalities themselves. That's very critical. You have to go down to neighborhood levels where environmental justice is an issue. Community residents, local community groups, and environmental justice organizations should play an integral role in creating and implementing these community level resiliency plans. So co-production, as we said before, always leads to better plans and better implementation, better adaptation of the plans. This type of community involvement would require that residents, community groups, and environmental justice organizations have access to sufficient resources to allow them to be equal partners with government in the development and implementation of these plans. Racial discrimination, particularly those types that may pose the greatest impediments to resiliency efforts, such as housing and insurance discrimination. There are lots of details on studies that show how implicit and explicit biases, what is often referred to as environmental racism, play into these things. Actions should be taken in an effort to ensure that these types of discrimination no longer exist or are at least minimized. The gap in procuring government resources after an extreme weather event that appears to exist between residents of the environmental justice communities and other communities must be filled, of course. And there are some bad examples, like how Katrina affected different socioeconomic groups in New Orleans, how Sandy affected different socioeconomic groups in New Jersey and New York, and so on and so forth. So this problem is far from being solved anyways, but awareness is high, and there are metrics which can be set up, maps made, and resiliency plans developed with community engagement. We have already offered a set of more specific recommendations, but more generally, in order to reduce climate change related vulnerabilities and increase climate change related resiliency in environmental justice communities, our society needs to address the root causes of vulnerability, such as poverty, racial discrimination, ineffective governance and planning, and unequal and inadequate access to resources and livelihoods. So obviously these are higher level problems that feed into health impacts, which is a more specific focus here, but nonetheless the umbrella issues need to be tackled as well. To reiterate, we must address racial bias and discrimination, economic inequality, unequal political power and access, indigenous rights, reduce the impact of climate change threat itself through mitigation, prediction, and warning and preparedness, build the capacity of environmental justice communities to withstand climate change related threats, not just health, but all those things that affect health, like water quality, air quality, erosion, sea level rise, inundation, storm surge, droughts, vector populations, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's a quick run through this problem of environmental justice, climate impacts on health and inequities. You can read up more. There's a lot of literature on this, and in another course I have called Bending the Curve, I have other broader issues of climate impacts on livelihoods, food security, water, air, and so on, and you can listen to those podcasts as well. Okay.